The dialogue.
I want to also take your view on the draft intermediate guidelines. You followed that debate. You've in fact responded also as part of the coalition, and you will be, of course, talking about it further. So where do you think we need to draw the line with respect to balancing privacy with security, and how far do you think the intermediate guidelines get there or don't get there, and what are the sort of recommendations you would like to give through this medium today, and what do you think the country should do in terms of going forward? Because we are still awaiting on the guidelines, the final draft of the guidelines, and I think that might take some time. But I think it's great for me to understand where do you think the debate could lead to, and how should we sort of evolve this approach with respect to safe harbor, and also ensuring that the security establishment gets what it wants.
Right. I mean, there are several provisions of the draft guidelines that I find very troubling from a data privacy and security perspective. I mean, there are a lot of reasons to oppose the guidelines. There are a lot of potential problems with them in terms of infringement on speech and going beyond, what the IT Act really empowers to do. But there's at least one section in the draft that requires traceability to figure out who the originator of information or message was. And that seems to me that would potentially preclude the use of end-to-end encryption, because in order to be able to figure out who sent information, you need to be able to see who sent a particular message. And the whole point of end-to-end encryption is that only the sender and the intended recipient can read a message, and not even the provider. So, WhatsApp is owned by Facebook. When you send a WhatsApp message, Facebook cannot read that. And so for Facebook to comply, to be able to say, okay, who are all the different people who have sent messages containing some particular piece of information, or falsehood, whatever it might be, that the government wants to restrict through these guidelines, they'd have to be able to read those messages. And so you wouldn't be able to deploy end-to-end encryption and also still qualify for immunity from liability under the IT Act. In addition, there's another part of the guidelines that require automated scanning and filtering for illegal content, unlawful content. And that too, because it requires being able to read all of the messages, all of the information going over the platform, seems to me like that is also at odds with providing end-to-end encryption. And I find this to be very troubling, because I think it puts intermediaries in a really untenable dilemma, where they either have to weaken the data security measures that they deploy, which protect the confidentiality of the communications that we exchange, which protect the integrity of the communications we exchange, so you know that nobody has intercepted and changed or altered a message or data that you're trying to send somebody before that person received it. They can either choose to weaken how they protect the security of our information, or they can choose to continue providing sound data security, but then be exposed to a massive amount of liability, all for what seems to me to be, just one small piece of the puzzle, as I mentioned, because there are so many other sources of information, and because even the metadata about these communications is not going to be encrypted, even though the message contents would be. It seems to me that this, dangerously alters the balance against data security, and more towards trying to potentially perhaps provide bad incentives for intermediaries operating in India, who are now trying to decide between, do we protect our users or do we protect our own bottom line against potentially expensive litigation?
And also, it's ironic because we are talking about national security and security all the time, but isn't privacy, let's say individual privacy, equally important when it comes to national security? Because safeguarding individual privacy is also a matter of security of that individual, and if she is part of the nation, and individual privacy should ideally mean security of the entire nation as well. So if you're exposing that in the first place, you also risk your own national security while going after certain elements that you might otherwise find through other means. What do you think of that?
I mean, when it comes to national security, there are several different ways that protecting privacy of data helps national security. One of those is that you need to be able to build up trust in the government in order to have people, be able to take part in government affairs. When you look at the data breaches and scandals that happened, first with Aadhaar a couple of years ago, and then with Arogya Setu more recently, these are all things that make people distrust government. And potentially risks, a danger if you're breaching the privacy of millions of people's most personal data, especially, in the case of Adler, like biometric data that you can't change. I think that does have a measurable effect on sort of the public safety and health, expectation around what you can expect from your government. And in addition to, just sort of the large scale fact that if you undermine everybody's privacy, that is a public safety issue. There's also the fact that everybody's using the same apps, the same services. And so if somebody's identity can be stolen, or if they can be blackmailed because information gets out about them, or if they can be impersonated because something either leaked out from insecure government database, or because encryption was undermined, and so it was easier to get into somebody's device or somebody's communications. Members of government use the same apps and the same phones and the same laptops that everybody else does. Yeah. Everybody uses the same, what we call commercial off-the-shelf products and services. And those can have some extra security measures added on if you are the prime minister of a country, or a member of the military, or what have you. But everybody's using the same things. And so if you undermine the security of a popular consumer app or device, that's going to be undermined for the members of government or members of military who are using it as well.
Right. Interesting you said that, Riana. We are also now in a state of lockdown, and we are all depending more and more on internet technology and the applications on the internet. And the government has in fact called out, I think, a fund, the government of India, to build an end-to-end encrypted video platform. So they do recognize the need for end-to-end encryption as part of security. And it's quite ironic, because on one hand, you might want to break through traceability, but on the other hand, you recognize that let's say, for example, Zoom should be end-to-end encrypted. There have been a lot of security concerns with regard to Zoom, and the Ministry of Home Affairs has actually categorically gone ahead and said, be wary of that, which is great. They're sort of warning the people. But on the same time, they may not be applying the same tools or the same rules when it comes to securing encryption otherwise on intermediaries. So there is definitely a need to sort of have end-to-end encryption. And how important do you think that is in today's times, that when we are going to live in a state of, let's say, a gradual lockdown, opening up, going back for the next 1 to 2 years until we have a vaccine sorted out, we will be depending a lot on video chats and video rooms to have virtual meetings and discussions like these, and other businesses which will be functioning and depending a lot on video applications. End-to-end encryption importance will only grow from here in terms of what I see. What do you think in terms of going forward, and how important do you think it is even now and in the future to safeguard that?
I think the COVID-19 lockdown has really shown how important promoting good cybersecurity, including strong encryption, really is. It's exactly as you said. Everything that needs to be private now is happening online, even more so than we were doing before in terms of the communications that we have. Now, any very sensitive conversation that you may have wanted to have face-to-face, or in a secure, a secure room where you could be sure there's nobody standing outside the door, trying to listen in, whether that's meeting with your doctor, whether that's seeing a therapist, whether that is consulting with a financial planner, or even just, having a very frank conversation with a really close friend of yours, and, confessing very, secret, private, intimate things. All of those are happening online now because we can't meet face to face. And so people deserve the same level of privacy for those conversations that they could enjoy when you were able to just go into a room with somebody and close the door behind you in order to keep out any sort of, nosy Nellies who might want to listen in on that. And so it's no surprise to me that India has been trying to encourage the development of an Indian alternative to Zoom. And Zoom themselves, to their credit, for all that they had a lot of privacy and security flaws and had made misleading statements about whether or not they used end-to-end encryption for their video calls, they have been working very hard on trying to fix those problems, and and even to offer some end-to-end encrypted video offerings. I think they just published their plan for that just a few days ago, I think. And so the more that we have more options out there for people to choose, and the more that companies can be transparent and accurate about what kinds of security they offer, whether they are end-to-end encrypting their calls or up to how many people, et cetera. That would enable people to choose among these things in order to figure out what works the best for them based on whatever their needs are. But if we can establish a norm across all of these services, that end-to-end encryption is something to try and build in, admittedly in a context where it's difficult just because of the problems of trying to manage a multi-person video call and be able to switch among the different people who are speaking, et cetera. On a live ongoing basis, it's a much different challenge than end-to-end encrypting text, right? Or sending a photo over an end-to-end encrypted app. I think establishing that as a norm will really push things forward, and it's going to be, we can't go back. There's no going back to normal in the before coronavirus times. It's going to have to be a new normal. And I think that data security and strong encryption is going to have to be a key part of that in order to prevent potentially, ruinous financial or personal consequences. If your confidential business meeting were to get leaked, or if you were to have sensitive medical information about you stolen, and then you just multiply that by all billion people in India having to worry about this, I think it's very plain that we can't afford to go back to a time where we disincentivize cybersecurity, which is why it's so disappointing that both with the draft intermediary guidelines and with proposed legislation in the United States, that seems to be exactly what both of our governments are doing right now at the worst possible time.
It's interesting also, Riana, one thing I want to touch upon is on partnerships, and you spoke about cross-border data flows. And I just want to sort of take the debate there a little bit with respect to access to data for law enforcement. I think we are all very cognizant of the need for law enforcement authorities to access data to solve crimes. I think that's something which all the stakeholders in the tech community agree that there is a requirement and there is a need to do that. But of course, there are ways to achieve that, and maybe localization may not be the best way possible. But how do you think India and US can collaborate when it comes to access to data for law enforcement? I think some of those collaborations on bilateral level, it could be under the Cloud Act, could maybe help sort of ease these challenges for the government when it comes to seeking data for criminal investigation. So I think how do you think those two debates could move ahead? And do you think there's potential for India and US to move forward, chart out, or let's say, a bilateral roadmap when it comes to allowing free flow of data, allowing encryption to to exist, while making sure that there are greater collaborations when it comes to seeking data for specific crimes which the governments might deem important?
Yeah, I mean, I think right now the path to more expeditious cross-border, obtaining of digital evidence, the future of that looks like getting a Cloud Act agreement between India and the United States. I don't know, I assume that the Indian government has been working with the US government to try and make that happen. There are a number of requirements that go into being eligible to get a Cloud Act agreement in terms of respect for privacy, civil liberties, human rights, et cetera, that the US government would have to be satisfied that both the law of India and the implementation of the law, not just the law on the books, but
right.
how effective is it actually in practice, that those are all being respected before India would be eligible for being able to negotiate an agreement with the United States. And this is something that had come to a head in recent years before the Cloud Act was passed a couple of years ago, because I know that investigators in other countries around the world were so frustrated about how slow it was to go through the existing treaty process that we had in place to go to the United States government and our federal law enforcement authorities and work with them to try and then have the US authorities serve a court order on to the US provider in order to get it. It's very slow, it's clunky. It has a months-long waiting period basically before you could get anything, in addition to having to obey the sort of magic words that legal process can require in the United States. And so, it always seemed to me that the Cloud Act was kind of unnecessary and that we could have solved the problems of the treaty mechanism without having to have a whole new law, without having to have all these agreements, just by providing better funding, more people, more manpower in order to speed up that process and have it be, a couple of weeks turnaround or sooner in true emergencies rather than a months-long backlog. But the Cloud Act is what we've got. And so that's, going to be where we go from here. Because the United Kingdom was the first country to conclude a Cloud Act agreement with the United States, it seems to me that probably a lot of other countries are going to base their agreement with the US in the same mold, probably even much the same language as the UK's. all of which, potentially poses some concerns about privacy, civil liberties, et cetera, in particular because it goes both ways, right? If India has a Cloud Act agreement with the United States, then it will be easier for US authorities to go straight to Indian providers, Indian intermediaries, and ask for information that's in their possession on their servers in India. So I think that there is a role for having some amount of legal process as a source of friction. You don't want too much friction in law enforcement investigations because you want crimes to be able to be solved and to be prevented. But at the same time, the kinds of sort of ridiculous treaty requests that providers reported getting, where there would be countries demanding that a U.S.-based intermediary provide information in order to investigate a crime involving the theft of a chicken. It's like, these are the kinds of things that maybe we don't want to be too easy. Yeah, we have to have some sort of necessity and proportionality principles built into wherever we go from here. And I think it potentially will be quite interesting for U.S. authorities to have the doors unlocked to being able to demand information from a country with 1 billion people, living and working and committing crimes and whatever else there. So we'll see what the future holds for the Cloud Act. Overall, though, my sense is that even if we do have easier cross-border investigations, easier data flows for those, that's not necessarily going to make governments in either country back off from demanding a backdoor to encryption. My view is that instead of viewing it as an either or, where if we give on one element, they'll back off from demanding the other element. And from what I can see, law enforcement wants to have as many tools available to it as possible. And so even if they are able to speed up the process of obtaining data from another country, from the United States, from a provider here, that's not going to mean that Indian authorities are going to back off from wanting a backdoor to encryption too.
Right. No, that's an interesting point. I think that's something which we are also following very closely. And Riana, lastly, I just want to sort of get a perspective from you. So what do you think is the future for privacy, for encryption, and also for the security and law investigation in the next, let's say, couple of years? The debate is evolving quite fast. Things are happening in India and the US. We've had COVID-19, which has, I think, brought in the importance and the realization of encryption technology now. And where do you think this debate will now move in the next couple of years? And what do you think organizations should do and pursue to ensure that we are able to keep up and live up to the right to privacy, which is enshrined as a fundamental right in India's constitution?
Yeah, I mean, I think it'll be interesting to see where it goes in both countries. Like I said, having that fundamental right to privacy, I think, is a very strong way to resist the impulse of government there, or potential guidelines that would require putting an end to end-to-end encryption. And so in the event that the draft guidelines for intermediaries do get passed into law, that seems like the fundamental right to privacy will provide the basis for a challenge in the courts there, hopefully. And I haven't heard, the last that I heard was that, like a month ago, that the government had not made very many changes to the draft amendments, and it was going to go forward with those problematic provisions that I had mentioned, which is regrettable. It seems like here in the United States, there's some question about whether our similar piece of legislation that would trade away intermediary immunity for encryption backdoors, whether that would pass or not. Supposedly it has sort of poor odds of passing. I'm hopeful that that will be true and that it will not pass. But you're right that I do think that everybody has had to have a wake-up call, thanks to having to move all of our activities at home and online, that encryption is for everybody. It's not just for protecting criminals. It's not just for protecting terrorists. It's something that everyone needs. And so hopefully that realization will allow us to talk to our respective governments and advocate for protecting strong encryption without some terrible data breach having to happen in order to point out exactly how important it is.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Riana. Thank you so much for taking up the time from Stanford. And it's been a pleasure talking to you, connecting to you today and talking about such important topical issues. And we hope to stay in touch with you. And thank you all for watching us. Please subscribe to the channel. And if you enjoyed this video, we will be coming up with more such discussions with experts around the globe. And pleasure having you all today, and we look forward to more such discussion in the future. So thank you, Riana, and we will be in touch. Have a good day.
Thank you.